Hello everyone, welcome to Handmade Hero, show where we code a complete game live on stream. Today, well, we got two things to do. One, we got some debugging to do, and then we've got to start playing around with our system and figure out, our big goal next is to figure out how we want to work these tags into our system. I'm pretty sure that we don't really need to keep doing what we're doing with the tags because we just have a simplified art process now based on what we actually got as art assets. We can make things simpler on ourselves. We don't necessarily need to. We could decide to keep it the way it is, but I just think we're going to pay performance penalties for the tags the way they are now, or have to do a bunch of work to accelerate it, when really now that we kind of know what our tag layout's going to have to be, it might be something we can just kind of forego. Before we go that, we got some bugs to work out and some missing things that we got to kind of fill in from the last time when we got the PNG exporter importer thing working. And that's really what I want to focus on today. Now, I realized after we ended the stream last week, I don't remember what I was doing. I think it might have been the next day when I was just hanging around or something. I remembered, I think I thought of why we had a problem with the thing we were doing. We just had finished the stream. We didn't have a chance to look into it at all. So it's probably something simple. But anyway, I thought in my head, I was like, oh, you know, it's probably because we're having an off by one problem because that weird requirement that you skip the first asset in any case, right? So when we're actually filing things away, we have to be careful to honor the fact that we leave slots open, right? And I just don't remember if that's what we were doing. But that would cause us a problem. So anyway, if you remember correctly, and I'll go ahead and try to refresh your memory here for folks who didn't catch last week's stream or people who've forgotten where we were since last week. If we take a look at the Handmade data directory, we've got sort of a set of things here where these are the HHAs that we already had, right? We had intro art, test 1, test 2, and test 3.hha. And then what happened was when we run the game, and if I run the game now, nothing will happen because there isn't one there. If I run the game, what we get is a check at startup to see whether or not there's a specifically named file. And if that specifically named file is there, it will use it as a place to write dynamically imported art assets that come from PNGs in the art directory. So what I need to do if I want to trigger the updater, right, is I have to actually have that in there. And you can see that code up in here where we actually load in the HHAs. You can see here that if there's a test to see if the thing is called local, then it assumes that that was something it can use for writing. Now what we did is we made a little program called HHA edit that we'll add to in the future to make more stuff as we want to be able to work with HHA files, for example. We can just say create local.hha, and when it makes one of those, it just sticks in a blank one that doesn't have anything in it yet. So now what happens is when I run, now it can process the PNG import, and it does. It processed one of the hand files, which was just this little thing. It was just a test to see if it would work. And we found already that we had one bug, which is that we don't reverse the RGB channels. So that's something to keep in mind there, right? So we've got some work to do there. That's really simple, though. The more concerning part, and the thing that was the bug that I actually want to focus on right now, was just that once we exit, what we've done is when that gets loaded in, we actually update that HHA file. So if I go back and look at the HHA file, you can see that it imported all the hand bitmaps. It's actually it imported them all, not just that one that we were looking for. It imported all the hand bitmaps and stored them in the local.hha. And now what we'd like to see is if I run this again, we'd like to see it show up again. But what we see instead is that we get an incorrect asset load occurring, right? I should set it to debug build so we can inspect these values a little bit better. It looks like assets is undefined for reasons I'm not entirely sure why that would be. But, excuse me. Oh, I see. It's because it's a local function. Of course it is. Anyway, I'm sorry, local variable. Anyway, we get a load error here, and so our first order of business is to actually step through and debug that HHA header updating code because obviously we've got some problems because our restart doesn't work properly. So our import works okay as far as importing into memory is concerned, but our import in terms of updating the actual backing store is not correct. So that's the first bug I want to address. Then we'll address the RGB flip problem. And then finally, once we're done with that, then we're pretty much progressing into the land of tags. And yeah, that's just how that's going to go. Okay, so let's take a look here. I just want to refresh my memory about the code and see whether or not the problem I was saying about leaving a slot open, I just wanted to see whether or not that was actually true, whether we were looking at that correctly or not. So the way that this works, remember, is we ask for an asset index here if we don't have one. So we come through, and if we're updating an asset that we already know about, one that we've already placed somewhere, and we're like, this PNG, we placed its asset here, or something like that, then what we end up with here is a new asset index allocation, right? So we try to allocate a new asset index to place that asset into our asset store somewhere. And so when we do that, the reserve asset call, what this is going to do is, I think it just gives us an asset in the global space, right? Let me just make sure that's true. Yeah, so that gives us an asset in the global space. And that's all it does. So it doesn't actually put that asset into the asset storage of a particular HHA file. So the first time we really deal with that is here. So you can see here we have write modifications to HHA. This is the first place that we actually start to deal with assets. So we come through here and we look at asset counts. You can see us taking a look at, we sum up the tags that each one uses, and we look at how many assets we're expecting to have in this particular HHA file, right? Just the one that we're looking at here. So when we sum that up, we get a particular number. You will notice we start that at 0, and we never add the additional 1 to it, right? You see what the problem is there? So when we actually start writing out asset indices here, we're not skipping that first one. And we really have to. I believe we need to do that because of the way the loader works. So in terms of the asset count, we really want to do it that way so that we know how many of those we actually have there. And then when we actually put these in, we can put in zeros. Now, I don't know if asset types array size perhaps can be... I don't know how that one works. I don't think that one has a null entry in it. So in some sense, I don't know how we want to do this. If we want to do it like that, sum it up and then do an asset count, you know. Like this. So I'm not sure how exactly we want to do that, but you know, if you take a look at how this would work, we have to do the same thing that we were doing before, like when we do our dest type, we grab this one. When we do our asset, like we're doing here in this dest array, we actually want to do +1, right? So this actually has to look like that, if that makes sense. And off we go. So again, I'm not really sure exactly how we want that to work. Excuse me, but I believe that's you know, more correct than the thing that we were doing before. I don't love the way that those things kind of move around, but you know, what are you gonna do? And we also should take here in these push arrays where we're zeroing these are actually cleared automatically by push array, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't believe this zeroing actually has to happen here. I'm not sure why that's still there. Get rid of it. But anyway, I think that's the more correct updating. So if I go ahead and delete that local HHA and then create a new one so that we can see if the import process goes a little bit smoother this time. Now when we write out that file, in theory anyway, let me just make sure that the import still works properly. Now at least it leaves that extra hole. And we could go test again and see now what our errors are here. Oh, and... let me double check here where we set this. Oh, so this asset type count also, so this is wrong here. Like I said, it's a little squirrely the way these work. I wish they were a little cleaner. I think maybe the best way to do it would be to just I'm trying to think of what the right way to do it here is. I think maybe we want, you know, asset type count to just be a different thing, I guess. Something like this. But I just don't like having those two there because, like I say, that was another mistake and it just kind of piles up. So anyway, if we have the asset type count and we use that a little bit more specifically, so we say that the asset types array uses asset type count, the asset array size uses the asset count. Now the asset count can have more in it there. So then we could say asset type count here. And then these are still all correct as they are, but this one, again, would be asset type count. And then when we go through here, the tag indexing file and the asset index file both can start at 1. So they skip their first entry, right? And off we go. We chain through here. We write out the different ones that we expect to see. We could add some assertions in here. We don't have any right now. I think that's probably a bad thing. It would make more sense to have some assertions in here. Like, for example, we should probably assert that the number of each thing that we wrote is the number that we thought we were going to write. So we should say something like, yeah, like tag index in file should be equal to the tag count, right? And asset index in file should be equal to the asset count. And then the dest type just gets updated by movement, I believe. Let me see here. Is it just me? Is it just me, or are we not updating that at all? So that would be another bug, right? Dest type, which is this fellow right here, dest type has to be advanced, and I'm not seeing that happen, right? So actually, this should also go like that, right? So we want to assert that dest type equals asset types plus asset type count. And I think that's just a little bit more secure now. So now, like, at least if we say we're going to write out a certain number and then we don't write out that number, then I will assert early on so that we don't waste our time thinking that it's going to be okay. And hopefully that'll help us. So let's now take a look at where we crash out here. Same place. So I'm going to switch to debug build now. And now I want to look at what we're actually, so I at least now have some sort of some opinion or idea here that we're probably going to have the right number of things written. Also, this uses the high water mark, right? Yes, that looks fine. So once we, yeah, so at this point, I'm pretty sure that we've wrote the right number of things out. So now what I want to do is set the build to debug and watch that import. And I'd just like to see what's going on there. And one thing I could do as well, so if I go through and set this to debug like so, just to get that going, what I can do here is if we look at what these other HHAs are, I can do something like this, like make a debug directory, move the local HHA into the debug directory. So it's the only one in there. And then what I could do is I can set the execution directory here to actually point directly to that directory. Well, I guess it's not quite that simple. I have to actually make also a data inside there, but that's okay. So what I could do here, let's do it this way. So we have our data directory. Let's make a debug directory here. So here's our actual data. Here's our debug, right? And inside here, I'll just make a different one of these with that local HHA in it, right? So that way now I can, if I want to, set this to be debug and will only load just that one, right? So now looking at when we step through here, we can actually figure out what's going on much more quickly because we'll only have to look at the bad file. We won't have to waste our time stepping through the good files that we already know work. So what we should see here is we should see only one file loaded. So that's what I'm going to check for first, right? And that file should be, the file in question should be the local one, right? There it is. So you can see here we've got the information for this file that we're about to load in. Here it is. It says it's got 13 tags, 12 asset types, 13 assets. That's the correct number, the number we expect to see. Those look reasonable. Those are arrays placed up above the data limit. The magic value I assume is correct. Let's take a look. 6661, 6868. I don't actually know if that's correct, but let's find out. It's not what I wanted. HHAF, yep. So that all looks reasonable. Everything's fine there. So the asset type, array size, computation and stuff should be right. This should all be fine. Let's take a look at that asset type array. No, it's right there. There we go. Type ID 20, first asset index 1, one passed. Is this just a pointer to a single one of these, I assume? So we should be able to look at all 12 like this, I'm guessing. So it just basically says, hey, there's a bunch of type ID 20s. So these are wrong. So that's bug number 1 from our debugging. We should see there be space. There should be one there, right? So when we update the HHA here, where is that? Here it is. No, this is not where it is. I lied. I just lied. Where is my update? It's not here. It's not there. It is. Write modifications to HHA. I got to remember that name. So when we write this out, you can see here, this was supposed to have a +1 in it and didn't. So it was saying there were no assets in the asset range. So that's obviously wrong. And that was probably the majority of our problem too, because what that means is when it comes through here, it's never going to find any, right? It's not going to get any, it's going to think it has none of those things to add. So, you know, that's, yeah, oops. So if I go back now and see, let me make a new one of these files. HHA to create local.hha. By the way, in case you don't already know, if you hit F8 on the Windows command line, it will recall the most recent command that started with what you've typed. So if you type like a beginning of a command and hit F8, you get the command that matches that thing, right? The Windows command line's pretty crappy, but at least it has a couple little shortcuts in there. And that one's kind of useful. So anyway, if I create one of those, and now I set us back, instead of using that debug directory, if I go ahead and set us back to Handmade, this should run the import again. And this time when we run the import, hopefully now it will set that stuff up properly. And we should be okay. Now we're still running in debug mode, so we're going to be much slower frame rate rise, but that's fine. And so if I close that down and now run it again, we can see we should have a different occurrence here. Now, we didn't crash, we loaded, but it's worth noting that we don't really still know, we don't know if we worked correctly. Now you may say, well, I see the little like mini sprite thing there. Doesn't that mean we worked correctly? It doesn't actually. The reason that we don't know if that means that we worked correctly is specifically because when we run the game again, because we haven't saved out, and this is the other thing that I said we were going to have to do, because we haven't saved out the metadata for the stuff that we imported, we therefore don't actually know whether or not a PNG has already been loaded. So what ends up happening is we can't tell. That could have just been the re-imported sprite. So to run a real test before we've done, you see it doubled the size because it just imported everything again. So in order to run a test before we write out the metadata, we actually can run the test first by creating one of the local HHA files, run the import once. Here it is running, right? When it's done, we verify that we have the thing we do. We close. Now we can do is move local HHA to test, for.hha or something like this, or import test.hha. Now it's not marked as importable. So that means there's no import destination, which means that it won't run an import. So now we can run it again, and we can check to see what we've got. And so now what we see is, we did actually get an import, but it's a different hand from the previous kind that we imported, right? Does that mean we did it wrong? No, probably not, because remember, we tagged all of those hands exactly the same way. So what that means is it's free to pick anyone it wants, and we probably just changed the order in which they appeared because of the way we imported them. So still seems like we're all good. We'll have to double check to make sure a little later, but again, our tag system doesn't differentiate between two things that have exactly the same tags. It's free to pick either one it wants, and that's probably just what it did here, right? So it looks good. Looks like we're in good shape. And so if I restore us back to the standard optimized build, we should be in a situation where we will run at full speed as well. At least I would assume. Yeah. And there we go. So from there, really what we want to do now is write out that metadata. And I think we probably want to, I don't know, I'm thinking that I probably want to sort of do these two things together, right? Like writing out the metadata and figuring out what to do with our tags a little better than we have been. I think those two things are maybe related. And one of the things that I kind of want to emphasize is that now we have we wrote a little utility, that HHA edit utility. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about that utility is now if we want to, we should be able to make we should be able to edit, right? Like we should be able to make a way that use that utility to update, import, or change HHA files. So if we want to, we can upgrade our HHA file format, and we don't have to really worry about backwards compatibility because we could just build a thing into that HHA edit that just takes old versions and updates them to new versions, right? So we have a lot of options there, and we could choose to use them if we want to. Now, we don't have to, but we could choose to. And so if we find ourselves a little bit cramped when we're making these changes, we can go that route because we now have the ability to do so. Similarly, if we wanted to, that HHA edit utility, like that's probably where we'll go ahead and put something like a merge. So you could say HHA edit minus merge and then type a bunch of files in and have it combine all of those files into one file. And so stuff like that, again, makes it easier for us to work with these files. It allows us to do things that we might want to do come ship time, like binding all of our HHAs together instead of shipping multiple HHAs, right? So anyway, I think that's all good, and I'm pretty happy about that. So I think now that we're there, I think now is the time to start thinking about how we want to address the tag situation. Now, the reason that I want to address the tag situation a little bit more carefully than we had been doing it in the past, I'll go ahead and delete this now. We don't need that, but we could use that trick again later. The reason that I want to kind of take a look at this is because if I go in here and look at the art directory, what we're doing now is we sort of have this notion of how sprite sheets come in. And those sprite sheets have a fixed shape that the artist is telling us they're going to use. That means we don't really need to store individual tags for these assets. We only need to store tags for the sheet. And what I mean about that is, like, if you look at the character template here, I'll go ahead and load it in. If we look here at what one of these templates looks like, all of the characters will have the same template, right? So all we really need to know what kind of an asset something is underneath that is just its index, right? It's 0 through 64, or, you know, X comma Y, depending on how you want to think about it. But it's really just a simple 6-bit value that tells you where you were in this grid. And so anything in the system that wants to look up something like this knows that all it needs to do is feed that 6-bit value into here, and it doesn't need to do matching. It can look it up directly, is my point. So we now sort of have guidance about how that would go, and we may just want to take advantage of it. Similarly, if we look at how these things are laid out, we know some type information, like we know that we've got like blocks, which are sort of things you could use, you know, to build sort of places in the world. So we'll probably have a ton of those. We have characters, probably have less of those, but, you know, maybe we'll have more. Who knows? A lot of characters, like monsters are characters, technically, right? So maybe we'll have a lot of those now I think about it. Hands, items, and, you know, obstacles, etc. We know we have these different things. Those themselves would be essentially the mainline types, right? Like, are you talking about a character, cover, hand, item, obstacle, or just like a something else, like a other, basically, right? So again, I don't really know how we want to do this, but let me lay out some things I was sort of thinking about in a little bit more broadly in terms of changing the line about where things are actually specified. So if, for example, in code we want to talk about things more specifically, what we could do is always talk about things in terms of we could always talk about things in terms of hard IDs that allow you to look up art assets directly, and we could still retain some of the tag matching stuff that we wanted by moving the tag matching to be something that you just use to get an ID if you don't know which ID you actually want, right? And so the tags could therefore be something that's more defined in code or extraneous to the art files themselves. It's just a thought. And again, I don't really know. It's really hard for me to guess how the right way to do these. And that's just because I haven't done many things like this specific thing. If I had done like lots of games' art tagging systems, for lack of a better term, I would probably have a pretty strong opinion about how this stuff has to go, because I would have seen a lot of examples of what works and what doesn't work. But that's just not a part of a pipeline I've ever really done much with. So it's very much sort of a wait and see kind of thing with me the whole time. I've never really been like, it needs to be this way, because again, saying something needs to be a certain way or having a very specific opinion about it should be done this way really only comes from experience. It doesn't come from just like smarts and thinking about something, because you usually can't guess all of the things that you're going to hit. And that's just generally true. Like, that's why also on Handmade Hero, sometimes I do stuff and I'm just like, look, trust me, we do it exactly this way, and here's some reasons why. That's because I've done that kind of code so many times that I'm like, believe me, this is always the way that works out best for these reasons or something. Other parts of code that I don't have as much experience with are usually ones where I'm like, I don't know, we'll have to see. And that is how that goes, right? Everyone has some more experience in some places than in others. And so it's important to know, this is something that you also want to become familiar with yourself. And for your programming over time, you don't want to be too dogmatic or sure about how you're programming something that you haven't had enough experience with, right? You want to be open to new ideas and new thought processes in lines where you're not sure of really solid reasons why things work out a particular way. Because if you close yourself off too early along a line that you don't have enough experience with and you haven't tried enough things, then you may be missing the best ways to do it, right? And so I don't know if I've ever said that explicitly, but that's why you'll often hear me say things in two different ways. Sometimes I'm telling you that here are all the reasons why you should do something this way. Otherwise, I'm like, we want to wait and see. That's usually why. It's like, I have a good, most of the time, internal barometer for I know how this should go because I'm pretty sure it will ship this way and be good, versus I haven't had enough experience with this thing to say for sure, let's try some things, right? And I think on any given project, you want to know that, you want to have that barometer, because assuming you want to continually get better at how you're coding things, you want to be aware of the places where more experimentation could be valuable to you and educate you as to how to do something in the future, right? So that's just something to think about. So long-winded way of saying, I don't have a super strong opinion about how this should go. The tag system was okay. I just think that looking at the assets we're getting back, it doesn't seem like it's going to do very much for us, right? Because the practical situation is just that the artist thinks about making a specific thing. This particular orphan, that particular monster. That's how they think about them. And so at the first line of import, it seems like you just want to reflect that fact, right? Let's import all the things the artist made and name them specifically what they named them. Then, on top of that, we could add tag matching if we have some times where the game just wants to say, look, I don't know what I want here. I just want something that is like blah, right? Now, the reason not to do it entirely that way is that if people want to add more stuff to the game, then they want to be able to add an asset that maybe fills in a niche that you didn't have before. And talking about this, maybe it might be helpful to sort of draw a diagram about what I mean here. So let's go ahead here on day 465. Art space. It sounds like some hoity-toity gallery in, like, you know, Manhattan or something. Anyway, art space. So let's suppose we want to do something where the generator generates monsters, and it gives those monsters 2 parameters, let's say, because that'll be easy for us to draw here. That's the only reason I'm saying 2. Let's say that it has HP, so like the number of hit points that this thing could take. Maybe certain particularly armored monsters take 8 hit points to kill, and certain other monsters that are not particularly well armored can be killed in 1 hit, for whatever definition of hit is in this game. Again, not related to Handmade Hero. I'm talking about this in the abstract. Obviously, it applies to Handmade Hero because we will have stuff like hit points, but I'm not trying to say something specific about Handmade Hero. I'm just trying to say this in the abstract. So we have a generator that's going to generate something for the number of hit points, and then it will also generate something for the attack power, right? So we'll also say something like, well, or let's say speed. So yeah, 1 is a particularly slow, right? And this is particularly weak, whereas this is particularly armored. And this is particularly fast, right? So we've got something here slow, that's a 1, and a fast is an 8 as well. So let's just say we've got those 2 parameters. So any particular monster in our system now can be described by a tuple, 2 values, its HP, and its speed. And that's just our thing, right? Again, not specific here. This is not how we're going to do it. It's just an example of something that might come up when we're creating our generator. If every monster is defined by an HP and a speed tuple, then we need to now pick the body of the monster from a set of monster bodies that are available. And I guess what I'm trying to say is we probably won't have 64 different monster bodies just for this one purpose, right? Because remember, when we actually go further down this road, there will be more than just the HP and the speed. There'll be the HP, the speed, what type of AI it's running, like is it skittish or aggressive? Is it holding a bunch of coins? Does it have this? Does it have that, right? So there's a number of things that we're going to be specifying here. It will get worse and worse in that respect. So what I want to emphasize is that like 64, even if that might be a reasonable number of monsters to have, well, it quickly becomes intractable even if you add one more, and we're probably not going to want to spend all 64 of our character sprite monster designs on just this one grid. But looking back at it, let's suppose we go, well, okay, so maybe monsters in this area are one way, and this area are one way, and this area one way, and whatever. So maybe we have one monster body. Here's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. So we actually use like 9 bodies, right, to represent 64 different possible discrete combinations of HP and speed. And what we do is we look to see where in this graph you fall, and that's how we figure out which body you are. So anywhere in between like 1 and 2 on speed and 1 and 2 on HP will fall into the A category, and we'll pick body shape A. Anything that was like 8, 8 will be body shape I, and various places in between. What I was sort of suggesting is that if an artist wanted to come along and place one of these things into a location that was not previously specified, so let's say they want to create a new area here where they create body shape J that's specifically for things that are sort of like 6-3, right? Like they're 3 speed, 6 armor. And that will take a bunch of things that used to fall either in C, D, E, or B, and it will now make them body shape J. And that's just a way of clarifying to the player to provide a little bit more specificity to the body shape to represent the underlying statistics to them visually more directly, right? So let's suppose we want to do that. Well, if we want to do that purely with art assets, then that kind of suggests that, right, the tagging wants to be in the HHA itself, because you don't want to have to modify the code. You just want to import a new file in there, right? But the reason that I don't find that a particularly compelling argument at the moment is more specifically because, look, the artist can't set that anyway. The artist is not in a position to specify in those things because the artist doesn't have the ability to really put any of that information into this file. It's a PNG. It doesn't have a way in Photoshop to cleanly edit those things because the artist would have to learn some like way of marking up code in a text file or something. So what that suggests to me, again, is just that we probably want that data to be a sideband. It's something that gets specified, if we have to put it in a separate text file, fine, but maybe that's how we do that. We don't do it by pushing all that stuff into the PNG. So what I'm kind of arguing for there is just the ability to say, let's have all of our art assets come in with hard-coded, well, not hard-coded, but integer-based IDs. And then if you want to associate those IDs in some way with picking, then we'll do that, right? So that's one sort of way we can talk about how that might go. Now, again, another problem that we would have with that is it doesn't necessarily merge as well. So as I'm sort of talking about it, I'm maybe talking myself out of it a little bit. What I basically mean to say is, let's suppose that 2 people on 2 separate machines decide to modify Handmade Hero by adding a new one of these things. If they just mark them up by tags, they merge properly. If they mark them up using some kind of fixed ID, then you have to worry about, well, how does that ID get set, right? So it kind of suggests for me that we really do want to maintain the tag system almost exactly the way it is now, and the only modification we really want to make is that maybe those tags are only relevant for picking things at the higher level. But even that, maybe that's not the right thing. I mean, in some sense, I guess you maybe just use hierarchical tags. I mean, it sort of seems like maybe as much as I thought that we would want to do something different, it seems like maybe all we really need to do is just split our tag system into two-stage tag lookup. The first tag lookup looks up what kind of a sprite sheet you're talking about. The second tag looks up inside the sprite sheet what actual glyph you wanted. I mean, I guess that just, I guess I don't see any reason not to do it. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think the tag stuff just is probably still the best way to go, and maybe we just want them to be hierarchical a little bit. So we kind of want to split the tag search up a little bit, but that may be the only real thing we need to do there, just to make it more efficient and a little more logical than what it is. But it seems like that always merges properly, and that's a nice bonus, especially for a community style project like Handmade Hero, where kind of the point is for people to go in and modify it and mess with it. Seems like something that would allow people to share PNGs, or HHAs rather, is pretty valuable. So I feel like I'm going to go with that. So I guess what I would say is the only real thing that I might want to add now is I feel like the problem with our HHA files is there's nothing in the HHA file at the moment that helps you understand where the data from that HHA came from, and because it's basically just a runtime format. It's the kind of format that I would use if I was shipping a game myself. And again, since this is not exactly that kind of a project, it's not the same as the kind that I would ship myself, it makes me think that we want some annotation in there. So I think really all I want to do after all that consideration, I really don't think I want to modify it that much. It seems like we made actually some pretty good decisions, even though we didn't have a lot of information to go on. I think we're in pretty good shape. I think mainly what I would want to do is, looking at the file formats here, I think what I would want to add is when we're discussing these, I think I kind of want to change the asset types array. I just want to get rid of it. And have the assets themselves store what type they were. And again, the reason for that is because now we're talking about more of we're talking about more of a editable file format here. And because we merge assets together anyway, we now know very specifically that those assets are going to be loaded into different slots anyway. So we don't care about keeping them contiguous very much at all in the way that we perhaps used to. And so it seems like it's just would be easier for these to just be arrays of assets. And so what I would want to do is have the array of assets and then also have some markup for the assets. So for example, something that stores the PNG file that these assets came from, so that when someone is looking at an HHA file that maybe they've received maybe they got an HHA file from somebody else and they're trying to figure out what's in it. Just a little bit of markup ability there so that they can gain a little bit of insight into what it is they're actually looking at. So for example, let's just go down that road. Let's just go down that road specifically and see where it leads us. And I think that's a little bit more. It's feeling a little bit better to me. What's going on there? So let's suppose that this HHA header file here. Let's suppose that what happens is this version gets incremented from HHA version 0 to HHA 1. And when it does, we now expect that the asset information is going to be completely different than it was before. And so in addition, to the asset types, like the asset types used to be there, it's going to not be there anymore. It'll just be assets. And the HHA assets themselves now get larger, right? So the HHA asset will have in it, maybe in addition to its tag indices, it'll also have some markup information. Or the other thing we could do is change this to be an asset markup thing, which is the thing that would tell us about what that asset was. So, it was asset types before. Later, it's different than that. So, let's suppose that, it used to be this. Maybe it becomes something like this. I think, we use U64 for file offsets, right? So there's some annotation in there, and maybe that annotation is just like a glob of text. You can put in there like stuff in a description or whatever else you wanted. So there's basically like information that you can use to understand what it is that you're actually seeing. That seems pretty good to me. And so, if we change the version, we get rid of this and we just have the markup from now on, right? That seems pretty good. I don't see a lot of downsides to that. But we would kind of rearrange things a little. So let me see what's in here. These are ways of removing assets. Yeah, we kind of got these primacy number things. This tries to remove. So this was sort of saying, hey, look, if you created a GUID for these HHAs, you could then say, oh, I want to override a particular asset. That part we haven't really figured out much about, and it's probably worth saying whether we would want to do that now or not. So when you load in an HHA, one thing we don't have the ability to do right now is have HHAs say that other HHAs stuff should not be used. So for example, let's suppose that you wanted to replace the version of the hero with a different version of the hero by putting an HHA file in there. It does seem to me like, hey, there's no way to really do it because the tags, if the tags match, it can just use either one of those. And so there's no way to specifically say which one that you would actually prefer, right? So I'm guessing, but I guess what we could do there is we don't really need that, because if you look at the way that our tags work, you could just have a primacy tag, right? You could just do this. we could just add 1 every time you want to replace one to the whatever it is that you were trying to replace, right? So the tag primacy value is just a thing that we then match on. We always take the highest one, right? I think that just works. So we really don't need this at all, I don't think. And that's nice because that gets us out of the business of ever trying to identify HHA files at all, which I don't think we really want to do. Like, we don't want to have to try and identify them. So anyway, let's just go ahead and kind of move forward with this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take a little bit of tact that I often will do. I'm going to go ahead and call this HHA header 1, and then I'm going to go ahead and make another one called HHA header 2, right? And this is just an updated version. And so I'm going to pull these out like so. And here's the secondary version of the file. And so what I was kind of suggesting is, well, all right, so we've got tags, and then we've got assets, right? And we'll leave those 2 in there, and maybe we'll change the asset struct to have some of that information. But we'll also have an annotation here. Right? So in addition to the tags array and the assets array, we'll now have an annotations array. I'm going to move the annotations array down like so, because it's kind of an extraneous thing. And I think because we're sort of playing around with this a little bit more and doing a little bit more with it, I think I might actually make this header file a little bit more extensible slightly, just because we don't know what we're going to need. I'm going to go ahead and say this. So now we've kind of got a block. In fact, I guess we'll do 12, so we'll make this an even number here. And then I'll go ahead and put in another set of reserved here for other arrays, stuff like that. So in here we got those 3 arrays there. I'm going to go ahead and say that this reserved 64 is going to be, what, 1 plus, I guess if I want maybe 8 more of the, I want 8 total or something like that. Then I would do 5, right? So these just leave us some zeros we can play with if we want to add things without changing the header, just if optional additions. So that's something we could play with later if we want to. And so the annotation count here is always going to be the same as the asset count. That's just the rule. And then we would have an HHA annotation, and off we would go. Now, since the assets now need a type ID, I think everywhere we actually see one of these HHA assets, we would need to specify what its type was. So we would have to have a secondary version of an HHA asset. And, you know, I mean, I could still put the type in there, I suppose. I'm just not sure how I want to do that. So there's a couple things about that. So I'm kind of torn here. The other thing that I'm not entirely sure about, again, is for the tags stuff. I guess I'm wondering whether we actually need type IDs on our assets at all. So the asset ID is just a quick way of saying that you're looking for something specific. A body piece instead of a head piece, right? But another way to do that would have just been to have tags for those things that you then match against preferentially. And so I'm wondering if that's really, we should just go all in on the tag system, and just the one thing we should do to change it is actually remove the concept that there is a type ID for an asset at all. Right? And that kind of seems like a good idea. The one aspect of types that I think... So the only thing that I'm sort of thinking about in my head, related to that, is the fact that that's also what we were doing to say which kind of an asset it was at all. So whether it was a sound or a bitmap or a font, right? So it seems like we still want like asset sprite, asset font glyph, asset sound. Is still something we want, because you don't ever want to match those external to each other. Now maybe you just... I mean, it's just weird to think that that would be a tag too. It seems like a waste of time, but maybe it's better to have that be a tag as well. That way everything just goes through the tag system and you're kind of done, right? And when you load things in, you can use those tags to sort of partition things in a way that you want. I'm tempted. I will tell you, I am tempted. So it's just kind of generic, right? And that way you only have one thing, and when you pull in the assets, you parse them out by those things. So, you know, in here you've got tag primacy and you've got tag data type. Right, and then you'd say, like, oh, okay, you know, we've got a thing that's like... something like this. And then in here you would just say, like, okay, there's, you know... what's the... oh, yeah. Something like that. And so you'd set those just in the tags, and so the tags it's always tags, right? Everything is always tags, and the degree to which we want those things separated out, we do at parse time, not in the file, you know. I think I like that. How much time I got here? Got like an hour or so. If I let myself go long there. So I don't know. I want to play around with it because, like I said, I really just don't know. But it seems kind of like the right thing to do. So I'm going to go ahead and say handmade file formats v1.h. And this is just a way I like to keep the files a little bit neater by removing things that get kind of like deprecated from a file format as it evolves over time. So if I wanted to keep these around, right, I can say asset type ID. This is an asset type ID from v1 that we don't use anymore, but we might want to keep around if we're trying to load an old file or something like that. Similarly, we've got like an HHA header v1. You know, that's what that used to look like, right? We've got this. And so then these things are the v2 versions. And similarly, you know, the HHA asset, if it did have a type, we would duplicate it as well. But like I said, I think I'm just not going to do that. So, you know, we're left with just this is what we're looking at. And yeah, I mean, that's basically it. So then when you've got these, excuse me, when you've got these sort of two different file formats defined, like I do at the currently, what I can do is I can go now to our HHA edit and I can include the old file format, right, as well as the new one in here. And so now what I can do if I include the new file format in here is I can make something that, for example, duplicates a file format, a file, and updates the header or something like that, right? Something that, you know, can something that can upgrade file formats and change, you know, a v1 file into a v2 file or something like that, right? Which is what I want to be able to do. So, for example, if I have a thing in here that allows me to read one of these in, right? So I'm like, okay, you know, we've got an HHA read here. And maybe I've got something like this. If I want to go ahead and look at what would be in here, right, I know that I've got like an HHA tag with the tags and HHA asset with the assets. And now I'd have HHA annotations with the annotations, right? So I know that these are the things that I would want to have in my loaded HHA when I would load it in. And so I could have a thing here that was like, okay, yeah, here's the read HHA. And here's the like write HHA. And so, you know, it could read and write we could read and write HHA. So for example, if I wanted to do something like this, we don't really have a good command parser here. I'm not going to really deal with that right now. What I can do here is just the same basic thing that we did before. So we take a look here and we say, all right, if we're going to like do a rewrite or something like that, then what we can do is have like a source file name and a dest file name loaded that way. We can load in the dest file. I suppose what I could do here too is like, well, I think I might do it this way. Maybe like that. So yeah, we got the source file and des file there. So what I'm going to do is say, okay, for the destination file and the source file, I'm going to open those two up. So I'm going to open this one up with RB, and I'm going to open this one up with WB. And I guess what I want to do is actually have an exists here. So, you know, we kind of did that. I want to make a thing that actually does that. So you can give it a file name and it'll tell you if that file exists or not. So what we'll do is we'll say file star test, and we'll do an fopen for read just to see if it exists. Is there an actual in the C runtime library? It's so limiting, but C runtime library file exists. Is there a way we can test that? That's not what we want. We want stat is basically what we want, but that's not really the C runtime. Why do all these things have underscores in front of them? Is that something they do now? Because like fstat is not a C runtime function, right? I mean, that's POSIX, I think. Unless they added it. I don't think they did. Because the problem with fopening something for read is if somebody already has it open in exclusive access mode, then it'll fail, but it is there, right? So what you want to know is just, does this file exist, you know? And I always just write this in the actual platform layer where it's almost always there's a function that will literally tell you exactly this information to get file info. And unfortunately, I really don't know that there is a particular way. It looks like standard file system : exists is maybe one of those, I guess. It doesn't look like, I'm not seeing anything from a standard library reference here. Yeah. Just take a quick look. I don't understand why these are all underscored. I guess that underscore ones are just the Unix ones or something, like ones that aren't technically in the C runtime library. Just weird to have most of them be underscored. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I don't really see. I don't really see one. So we'll just keep doing it this way, but it's not great. You know, normally you'd do this with an operating system call that's actually good, if you cared. So, oh well. So we'll go ahead and say that is how we know that the file exists if we can open it. And we'll go from there. So we can also say Now down here where we do file already exists for our create one, we can just do literally if file exists, file name. In this case, we want it to not exist, right? So here we just go, okay, if it doesn't exist, go ahead and do this. Otherwise, it already exists and it's bad, and that's fine. Here we can basically say, you know, if file exists, source file name, and file exists, des file name. And we want to not that one. Then we go ahead and do our shenanigans. So here we can say, so something like that. Just to let the person know that they can't overwrite a file with it or whatever. Something like this. So now it's a little bit clearer just what's going on there. So if we get into a situation where we can actually do it, we load one for reading and one for writing, and then off we go. I won't be specific with the error message here. I don't know if you're allowed to fclose. I don't think you are, actually. So this is a good example of kind of something stupid. So this is the way you would want to write that code, right? So because you don't really want to have lots of different error handling paths. So you want to be able to open both source and des and then close both source and des. I actually think technically you can't do this. I think you have to actually do this. You know what I'm saying? It's just dumb. But at least I guess now if I do that, I can make a better error message. Which I guess is not nothing. There we go. So if we couldn't open the source, then we print an error. So we couldn't open the des, we open error message. Assuming we could open either of those, we close them. All right. So now what we want to do is we want like this path to do like read HHA and this path to do write HHA. So, read from this, write to that. And in this case, we'll have one of these loaded HHAs that comes back. So, off we go. I'm not going to do that. We'll do this either way. So that is, how that routine would work. Pretty straightforward, right? That doesn't want to be there at all. All right. So yeah, in this case, we want to make a v2 header, right? And off we would go. Let's call it a v2 header, not a, there we go. Yeah. And technically, since we don't need to label our most recent version, we can just call it an HHA header, right? And then we'll get that here. And I guess technically that was a v0 and now this is a v1, so maybe this should actually be called v0 to line up with the actual version number that's in the file. So I think I'll actually call it that. Let me go ahead and rename that file as well to a different file name. So it should, instead of being v1, it should be v0. So now what we can do is, yeah, this guy will work properly. It will write a file of that particular version. This will rewrite one that we get. Let me make sure we can compile this now. Something useful. There we go. So now we've got the ability to use this to rewrite a file if we implement these functions. Before I do that, I want to add one more thing here, which is I just want like a something like this, or info, let's say. And what info, I want info to just give me like information about the file that I provide, right? And so this one, I suppose, doesn't need to check for existence because it's not overwriting anything. So we can just do it this way. So we load in, the file name. We would want to open it for reading like so. And then what we do is we just say like, okay, give me back the loaded HHA for this thing. And then inside here, what I would want to do is print out the info from it. So I think what I would want to do here is inside the loaded HHA, I think I might want to store some of the stuff that was in there. For example, I could store the magic value and the version number. And I'd want like the tag counts and that stuff. I'd need that anyway, right? So I'd need that stuff here. Yeah, so I think if the annotations wouldn't look like this. All right, so let's see, source file name, something like that. It's just a bunch of text here. And these want to be kind of strings, right? So probably want something like this. Problem is that doesn't stack very well. So, I might actually just go ahead and say it looks like this. Something like this. And I suppose in here we could stick an author in there, maybe would be something. So you kind of know where it came from. And the annotations, I think that's reasonable. We could add another array if we wanted other kinds of annotations there. I don't think we need expandability necessarily in there. So that would give us what we wanted there, and we could have the version, the source version in here, which is like which version it came from. And that would let us know. We could also say that annotation 0 gives us some basic information about the file. I don't really know that we want to do that because then when you merge two of them, I'm not sure how you would resolve that, so probably not. But that's, yeah. So if I go ahead and implement the load HHA bit here, then what I could do is I can, at the very least, take a look at what's in the header. So if I do a header, an HHA header v0, I can go ahead and do a read of that. I suppose what I can do is I can actually look at this as two different header versions here and just peek at the initial values, right? So what I could do is say, all right, let's take a U32 for the magic value and a U32 for the version. I'm going to go ahead and f-read those in here, right? Maybe I even do it this way. So I say, look, load in here from the source file. And then maybe we have errors here. So this will tell us what's actually in the file when we do this fread. And we can compare that here. So if ID pair 0 equals HHA magic value, and in here, we can look at ID pair 1 and see if it's HHA, if it's 0. This tells us the versions. And off we would go, right? So here we've got a load read HHA v0. And here we've got a read HHA v1. So I think that supports both of those. To be honest, I'm not sure we really want to do it that way. I might want to do it this way. Or maybe call it like that. I think that's probably just better if I did do that. So that it sets it up here. Just seems smarter. Don't know if I've got a way to allocate. Do I have the ability to use memory here? I don't think I do. So what I want to do here, I guess, is just a malloc. So we can have one of those, and I want to be able to zero it as well. Really want like the basic arena stuff there. So again, it would be nice if we had that. We don't at the moment. But let's see here. I guess we can play with that in a minute. So if I just return a zeroed one of those, then I should be able to actually run this okay. This passes the result in here like so. And those don't need to happen. Okay, so load HHA, identifier not found. It's because it's supposed to be read HHA. And when we dump the info now, we should, oops, that's not what I wanted. When we dump the info now, we should be able to take and dump stuff like the magic value or the version from the loaded HHA. So in here, we can dump the source version. We know the magic value was the magic value, I guess. Although now that I think about it, we could just save whatever the magic value actually was and put that in there, I suppose, now that I think about it. So we could just say something like this. so that those are actually known. Yeah, that seems reasonable. So if we do an info dump, we load one of these in, we could then actually printf here. I suppose this really wants to be that. It wants to be printed as characters because that's at least nominally how the magic value is supposed to go, I guess. So we know it's for long, and we know it's the magic value here, right? So in theory, that's all we really need there. I thought it was read HHA, isn't it? Oh, read HHA. I don't know what an HHD is. That's new. I thought we had version in here. Source version, sorry. And so that gives us, I think, everything we need to get started playing with this. So if I do HHA edit now, oh, I should put in description of that there. So now if I do info and I print one of these out, then I should be able to look and just see, you know, that these various files that we have are version 0, and that's really all I wanted to do with that. So you could then see that one was version 0 or one was whatever. So if I was to create one now, so like let's say I created one of the, you know, dummy.hha or something, right? Then if I do an info on that, I'm hoping that that would give me a version 1, right? So now we have two different versions of the file here. I don't really want that one anymore, but that's the idea, right? So then for loading, we just need to write a little loader and a little saver, and then we can have our two... then we could have not only a way to dump the information if we wanted to look at it a little more carefully, but we'd also have a way of updating files that were with a previous version, right? So let's take a look at how we would do that. So let's suppose that what we want to do was read an HHA. What I want to do here too is fseek back to the beginning. So I would like the source file in this case to come back to the beginning. One of the problems that we're going to have here, and I don't know how to get around this a little exactly, is I don't know if fseek actually supports 64-bit. I hope it does. I think we looked and it does now support that. Well, I'm not sure what long int actually now refers to. I guess we'll find out. But anyway, so hopefully we can still do 64-bit seeks on this. I don't know if we actually can. If we can't, this is going to be unfortunate. Luckily for us, we don't currently have any files that are over 4 gigabytes, but since we're storing our bitmaps currently uncompressed, we easily could. So, oh well. But anyway, inside here where we've got our read HHA, version 1, version 2, I'm going to go ahead and fseek us back. Pretty sure that's how that works. Set it back to the beginning. So in here we can load in the new information. So here we'd have an HHA header v0. I'm sorry, 0, v0, whatever it is. Header. Oops. We'd do an fread of that. And I guess one of the things that's a little bit squinky here, I suppose we need to keep the data store somewhere, so we probably would need like that. And so we really just want to read the entire file, probably. In fact, that probably is the easier way to do this. I think we have that in our test PNG. So if we want to, we can do that here. And maybe that can just be an operation that also returns the size. I don't know to what extent we care about that. But if we did this, we would now have the ability to just read the entire thing into memory, like so. So if we just read the entire file in like that, then that's the data store, so that's the entirety of that file. We don't actually want to do the fopen here, so we could just do it with the handle, like so, and do this, right? So if, for example, we do the read entire file on that, then what we would do here is just say result data store equals read entire file, source file. And then this stuff doesn't actually need to do that fread. It can just try here to get the information out. So the only question is, do we care about crash prevention here? Like if we didn't read anything in, and I don't really think we do for any particular reason. Can't think of why we would. But so if we actually said, like, look, this is a U32. Same with this. Then what we can do is just test these. And I think that's all we really need to do there in order to make the read happen. Let me just double check that that actually worked. I think that should have been an arrow in all of these. All right. So looking through here, I should be able to now do the same thing I was doing before. And it should give me those back, which it does. And so now I know that I can do an HHA header v0 here. And I can look at the data store. So what that allows me to do is now I want to start making this translation here. I want to make an HHA edit.h file because I would like to move this up there, right? Because just to keep it so I can view those two at the same time. There we go. So looking at that, we can see that what we need to load is the tag count, the asset, and the asset count is worth of stuff from these two things, and that shouldn't be too hard for us to do. If we're loading in a v0 file, we have to do the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? We have to do the we have to do the version upgrade, we have to change it from v0 to v1. I don't know what you want to call that. The update of the data format. And if we're reading v1, then we don't, right? So if we want to read HHA v0, then once we get the data store out of there, what we could see is we know exactly we're going to do this, right? We're going to say the HHA tag count equals something, and then the HHA tags is going to be a malloc of that, right? So this is just going to be an allocation of those things. The same is true of the assets array and the annotations array. So we're going to go through and figure out what the tag count is and what the asset count is. Oops. All right. So we know we want to do assets, and we know we want to do annotations, and we want the same number of both of these. So there's an annotation for every asset. And then the data store has already been done for us, so that part is not something we actually have to do. And then what we have to do is we have to loop over the assets and process them into these, and off we go. So the important thing to remember here is that when we go to actually do the tags, we're going to have additional tags for every asset. Specifically, if we want to do what I was suggesting about having the tags themselves now specify all the information, then the data type tag is going to be added to every asset. So it's actually inside the tag count. It's actually going to be the tag count plus the asset count, because for every asset, we need to add a data type tag. Right? We also know that we've got an additional sort of like blank that's left in there, a 0 tag that doesn't get loaded, which is super annoying, has been causing all these problems. So I'm not sure we really want to do that, but you know, I don't know how to make it necessarily any cleaner than it is, because if you didn't add it, then that also means that when you go to translate where all of your things are, you've got an off by 1 there, because now everyone is saying I use asset 12, but they really mean they use asset 13, and they're just not talking about the 0, right? And all the things like this. I'm sorry. They say they use asset 12, but they're really talking about asset 11 in the file, because there is no asset 0. So you push your off by 1 errors to one place or the other, and I'm not sure we picked the best one, but I don't know that there's one that doesn't have any of these problems, because if you want your 0 to be a non-tag, you got to do something about it. Anyway, so taking a look at these, that's how this would look. And the only difference here is that if this asset count includes the null asset, that asset obviously is not going to get a data type. So it would be a -1 there. So that's what that looks like. And now we just have to kind of look at what we actually are going to have tags-wise. So looking at the tags, just trying to think it through here, what we probably want to do is say, well, if we're looking at a v1 file, I'm sorry, v0 file, we know that the tag count is specified directly. The asset type count we don't care about, and the asset count is also correct. So we can just, I think, load these directly. We should be able to say, like, okay, the header tag count is the tag count. The header asset count is the asset count. I think that's just correct. I don't think there's anything else weird that we would have to do there. When we load out the v0 header, it should just work. Then what we have to do is we've got to go through and go read by asset types, because that's how these files were structured. So we're going to have to use those and unpack the assets into the asset array that way. Now the annotations, for our purpose, are going to have to be filled in with default annotations in this case, and that's okay. We can do that. What we need to do there is say, okay, there's a default annotation of some kind. And that default annotation should probably have just like a default annotation is one that, like, we didn't have an annotation, so we have to tag it with one now. And so what that would be is something like looking at this annotation where we've got these various strings in here. What we need to do is do something that will write an annotation out to the file and give us back its result. So we would probably want something like a write annotation here, and it would take the source file base name, That's going to be whatever the source file name was here. And again, that we probably should know what that is. We should probably have a way of specifying what that is. Something like that. We'll take a look at that in a second. We have an asset name. The asset name is not known. So it'd probably be something like just an unknown. Fill in there. The asset description would be none, or would be like imported by read HHA v0, right? And the author would just be HHA edit .exe. And so maybe I'll just dispense with the parentheses. So like normally what we'll do is we'll have a way of putting some annotations in there for new files so that we'll kind of have something that carries along with the data as it goes forward. But for the moment, like all of our old files, if you ever imported a v0 file using this utility, it just marks it as like, we don't know where this came from. Like it's, who knows? We imported it from another file and the file didn't have annotation data. So as far as we know, they came from the ether. And that's what we're trying to tell you, right? So what we'll do here when we load all these things is literally every single annotation in question will get this stamped on it. So every single asset will just get the same annotation stamped on it, period, and off you go, right? So the assets themselves, on the other hand, those will be the same. We didn't update that file at all. So each asset index that we load in this case, is going to be exactly the same as the asset that we had. And the only thing that we're probably going to, now I think about what we will have to update though is the tag array. So it's not exactly true. The first tag index one pass, last tag index is going to have to get modified. So we probably want to do a thing here where we do dest asset and we create dest asset from here, like so. So we'll copy that in, but then we need to do a first tag index, one pass list tag index. This kind of has to be updated, right? The annotation doesn't have to be updated because the annotation always just gets set the same way no matter which asset index we're actually on. So that part's fairly straightforward and won't need anything. And so this is going to end up being a double index here. This is going to index first over, I shouldn't say index. This is going to iterate over each of the here we go, asset type arrays. And for each asset type array, we'll go through all the assets referred to that type array, and that way they'll know what type ID it is. Again, that's the thing that we've removed. So it's just going to use that first to sort of place some information back into the file that we can use later. Now, what I don't actually know how we want to do exactly, again, is what the tags will actually be for these things that we're looking at here, like head, cape, torso, grass, tuft, stone, rock, sword, tree, shadow, font and font glyph, that sort of stuff. I don't know exactly how we want to specify those asset types out separately. There are a few ways we could do it. One way is we could just define an asset type v0 thing, and we just copy them over directly and figure these assets are assets that are going to go away eventually, one way or the other. And so either you set that to, a new version or you use the old version. I'm not sure, like I said, how I really want to do that. We should probably think about it a little bit more carefully. And maybe we won't touch that part of it till next time. We'll have to think about it a little bit. But for now, let's proceed with the straightforward translation of the asset types arrays. So in here, what I want to do is loop over asset type index. And for every asset type index here, that should be in the asset types array. I think that's a thing that's actually in here. oops, I meant header. So it's this parameter I'm actually looking for. Yeah. And so for each of those, I want to look at the source asset types of asset type index. And that'll give me an HHA asset type v0, right? From there, I want to do a loop over the source asset index. And that's not the same as the asset index, right? In this case, or I should say this is the, asset type asset index, however you want to look at it that. No, actually, it is a source asset index. Because it's stored in the asset type, absolutely, right? It's first asset index. It's actually correct, right? So it's like, that's the thing. One pass last asset index plus source, right? So that's actually going to give us the source asset index that we're talking about, like so. And so for each one of those, we will just put it into place with the dest asset index this way. So that seems pretty straightforward. That allows us to unpack these the way that we want to. So really the only thing we have to do is modify the tag array there in order to make this work properly. We should also zero out. So we should take the HHA annotation and the HHA asset and also the HHA tag. And we should set those. So the HHA assets 0 should be the null asset. The HHA tag 0 should be the null tag. And the HHA annotations 0 should be the null annotation. And by the way, a reason I'm doing it that way is because technically you can do this now. At least I think you can. But not all compilers support that. Like, for example, Visual Studio, even, I want to say maybe even 2013 didn't support it. 2012 definitely didn't support it. So in the interest of supporting compilers a little bit further back, I still write it this way, even though modern-wise you wouldn't have to do that, right? You could just use open close bracket right on it, which is much more convenient, but not actually supported everywhere quite yet. So maybe in 5 years you can just forget about that, but not quite yet. Anyway, so the tag count here needs to actually use the asset count from the source asset count, if that makes sense. So this is actually header asset count. Here we go. And so source file name, this is interesting. So source file name in this case, I think I want to pack that into the HHA. Like, I'd like to put that here. Probably. And this kind of argues that what I really probably will need to do is actually make it so that the file is loaded inside here. I had sort of resisted doing that a little bit, but it looks like that would be better anyway, because if the error checking happened in there, maybe that's just cleaner, because then you don't have to check in the error twice. You don't have to check it once here and once here. So I could just make it so that this actually works outside. Seems okay to me. It's just this, right? So in here, I would just say, like, okay, if you want to load one of these, you try to, like so. And you get an error here if you can't. So if we did it that way, then this right here becomes source file. And source file name, source file name is the actual thing that you would be passing in. And the loaded HHA in this case is the result. Right? So the other thing I might do is I might actually just let this continue to work this way. So maybe you always get one back, but maybe it doesn't have anything in it, right? So I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. Yeah, I mean, I think I might want to do that way. So maybe what I'll do here is put a valid flag in here. And so, you know, only once you've actually read it in does it consider it to be valid. And otherwise it doesn't. Otherwise it's considered it to have been a failed read. And that way in here we could say, well, all right, if the loaded HHA is not valid, then we're not going to write it. You know what I'm saying? And that maybe seems a little bit saner. So I'll come through here and just say, all right, that's, you know, and this is if not file exists, dest file name, blah, 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 blah. And again, like, just that felt a little bit better to me. I don't have a strong reason why. It just felt a little better. I guess that can go right here. And off you go. So that seems fair. And then these get a little simpler, right? These we can just make, they don't have to look like this at all anymore. It's going to just look this. And that is nicer. I mean, I think that's just easier. Like, it's nicer for people who are trying to make things with this utility. So that does seem like probably that was an improvement. And well, this one, I guess, I don't know what I want to do with quite yet. Probably I want a thing that just creates a null header, and we'll change over to using that later. But for now, this seems fine. So we're okay here. I think that's all good. And so here we would write the file at this point once we get it. So here's us reading it in, and there's us writing it out. So now if we go to start compiling and we see the right annotation here, that's something that we haven't actually implemented yet. We'll get to that in a second. Let's see what else we've got. Source asset types and source assets we haven't read from the file yet. Well, we read them from the file, we just haven't pointed to them yet. So we want to do that. So for example, in here, right, we want to do, and I guess actually we could just do it right here. HHA asset, source assets, that's just going to be an HHA asset cast of the data store plus what the data store says the assets array location is. The same is true for the types. And the same is true for the tags. So that just basically gives us all of our source, like all the stuff we want to read from. Oops, that's supposed to be V0. because that's not around anymore. So at that point, we just need to do our tag rewriting. And is there anything else we did not do yet? File exists needs to move up in the world. Like so. And that's it. So I think now that's supposed to be annotations. Yeah. So I think that's all good at the moment. But again, so what we need to do here also is when we go to actually write annotations. So what we're going to need is we're going to need the ability to talk about data that's not in the data store that as it currently exists, right? So like we have to be able to copy data that's in the data store forward. And that's a little harder. Like that part's going to be a little bit trickier, right? Because the data stuff that's in the data store varies depending on how it works this way, I think. So the data offset's there, but we don't have the size, right? The size is implied by whatever the type is. So it's a little more work for us. We have to look to see which type this was. And then we have to move it over. And that, to me, also, that kind of suggests, again, that maybe we want to actually just include something that lets us we just want to include that information directly, right? So we want to have like an actual... We don't want to have to jump in here and figure out what the actual size of the thing was to copy every time. We might want to just write it, you know? I'm not sure. Like, I couldn't say for sure. Like, maybe it's better to just always actually compute it. They're pretty easy to compute, at least for these two. And HHA font's a little harder. It's 2 arrays. But, you know, these are much more direct. So it's hard to say which one of those you would want to do, whether it's worth it to actually have a size field for something that you wouldn't have to do. But when you go through here, you would have to know, like you have to know which type it is to move it, because you need to know how big the data is that you're moving. So yeah. So wiring all this stuff up at that point should be fairly straightforward, though. The only weird thing here, again, is that the annotations, because the annotations are missing, I think I might want to basically have those be unpacked. So I feel like I might want to do this as loaded HHA annotation. I might want to just have that so that this is actually done this way. Oops. Trying to think if there's a smarter way to do this. There might well be. So we might want to do it this way, where we just say, look, these things are, you know, just stuff that you have in a loaded C version. And, you know, other things may want to be that way eventually as well. Hard to say. But let's just claim that that's the case. So in here, when I go to create that array, I'd actually do this. And then what I can do is say, well, the default annotation is actually this. And then off we go, right? There we go. So now we're down to just the tagging, and again, that's sort of the thing. That we don't really know how we want to do. So I may stop there and pick that up next week. Other than that, we have the things loaded. So if, for example, I undid those two lines, we should have our HHA. We can also continue having the other things compile if we want to by inside the asset inside handmade.h, where we include the asset, the file format. So that's right here. Right after that's included, we can, if we want to, use a pound define to change things back. So for example, in the in file formats v0 here, we can shuffle these around. So like, for example, if we just include handmade file formats v0, this is a temporary thing. If we include that, we can define HHA header to be HHA header v0, and we can define HHA asset type to be HHA asset type v0, and that will like use, oops, find asset type ID, set type ID 0. So that would solve our problem there, right? And the only thing I guess that I have to do here is in file formats, this part here, you know, if we decide to go this route, which I don't know that we will. So that allows us to keep compiling and keep running properly, even though we kind of have a split version now. So in theory, this should still work, I assume, although that turns out to not quite be the case. Which asset file are we looking at here? Did I not have keep everything the same shape? Let me just double check what I've got here. We've got header, asset type, and ID. Those all should have been the same. And we didn't mess with the tags. We have annotations, but they should not be in the file. So all of this stuff should be fine. And the header should be fine too. Right? Yeah. And we don't have any HHAs that aren't the old HHAs, right? So everybody's fine there. Yeah, so we should be able to, just to leave this compiling, which is the only thing I was actually going to try and do. We should be able to make it so that we can use the old versions by just pound defining the new versions to be the old versions. And that way everyone in the asset system still uses those older versions, right? So they'd still use all of this stuff. But it didn't look like that worked properly. So I want to take a quick look and see why. Because we should be able to still compile with the old asset loading, right? And that should, in theory, be the case. So let's take a look. Take a look at the file here. It has version 0, which is what we would expect. There's not much else going on there quite yet. We should also look at the handle. There's no errors yet. So it's got all the stuff set that we expect to have set. So that's good too. It's got the asset types. No, so this is wrong. So it isn't using the... It's using the wrong size for that fellow. Oh, this is outside of the pragma. Which is not good. You know what? I should just put this in here. Because these have to be inside the pragma. Well, I guess what I could do is I'll just put the pragma in both places. Right? It's supposed to know, it has to know specifically how things are aligned there, right? It can't leave gaps and it can't do other stuff like that. So these have to be inside the pragma where we define everything. We also need to, this version, I need to redefine the version number, which I guess I forgot to do that as well. So inside here, we need to do a pound define HHA version 0. So we'll just undefine it and define it anew. Okay. So let's try that one more time. So there we go. So now we're just loading correctly. So I'm going to leave it like that. And then next weekend, what we'll do is we'll pick up where we left off on here. So we'll just make a thing that allows us to import our old files and change the file format over. It'll add annotations in so that we can then from now on, when we import stuff, we can keep those annotations. We should probably put into the file as well what the annotation, what the source location was. So you know what the other thing we should do is in here, we should get rid of this thing, the asset indices thing. What we should do instead is, well, we shouldn't get rid of it. We should put in the that source information into the annotations here. So basically, this annotation would also have a sprite sheet X, sprite sheet Y. So it like tells you where it was in the source file. I don't know if there's anything else we want there, but I'll just pad it out so that it's even size. Yeah, and I guess, you know, if we wanted to, we could store the file date even in there too, I suppose. I mean, while we're at it, right? If you just put everything in there. So maybe that is what we should do. Just do that. So maybe we'll do that stuff. And that way we can have all those annotations in there. They can always be stripped out when you ship the game if you needed the space. That's why I put them in a separate array, because they're not actually necessary for anything. But I feel like, again, since this is a game that you want to encourage people to play around with, leaving the annotations in is how we will probably end up shipping it. But I put them in a place where you could strip them out, because that's probably what you would want to do when you actually shipped the game. Normally, you wouldn't want to waste a bunch of space with metadata that you didn't actually use when you were running it. All right, let's go to the Q&A here. Let's see, Q&A. So instead of tags, why not relegate the logic of picking a range of or random bunch of specific assets to the part that pulls assets in, e.g. when making a new entity or what have you, have a way to specify, hey, pick one of from these specific assets here by path name or some other identifier. Obviously comes with its own issues, might not be what you want and all, but is it idea of entertained? So we got two problems. One is, first of all, well, I should say, first of all, before I say anything else, that is sort of what I was suggesting, right? Meaning you would have ways of segregating the tags out into two sets. One set that's when you create an entity you use to pick from the tags that way, and then another one that's inside there when you're actually using that entity that helps you pick stuff like facing direction and things like that, right? So I was kind of thinking that, but there's some problems. So the first problem is if for hot loading, if you want to be able to support like load in this new PNG, that maybe the PNG specifies a new set of information that would change the thing you would have picked in the entity creation thing. That entity won't change on the screen, but it should have, right? So picking every frame is not a particularly good idea from efficiency, but we may have to at least have a way to make sure that that does happen. Like we want to be able to repick when we know that our assets have updated, right? So we need to kind of have a way at least of repicking to support hot loading. But yes, beyond that, it would be okay to pick at least part of the tags first. Other tags like facing direction, those vary over frames, so they can't be handled in the same way. Right. We will not be adding scripting. Are we going to use type def for the enums? No. What do you mean type def for the enums? I'm not sure what you mean by that exactly. We're just using enums as enums. Also, is an unnamed union inside a struct legal in terms of ANSI C? I don't think so. Unnamed unions and unnamed structs inside. So unnamed unions and unnamed structs in general nested inside each other, I don't think is supported by ANSI C or ANSI C++, but I could be wrong about that. It's far too useful not to use and should be part of the spec, like for sure. Since all the compilers we care about support it, we use it. Whether or not it's in a spec somewhere, though, I couldn't tell you. Will HHA contain hashes, checksums for original input files? This might allow a nice way to only update the changed assets, even if file timestamps are off. I didn't really want to implement a checksum, but we could. So there's our offsets, there's our date and checksum. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8. Don't ask me why I padded those up to 8. I just did. If the entity holds a reference into a table that looks up the asset, then that would work with hot loading. No, it would not, because it's the selection that's the problem, right? So, for example, let's suppose we go back to that diagram. Remember this? So we go back to that diagram. If you had a table of indirection, all it would do is allow you to replace A with something else. But it wouldn't allow you to subdivide A into new quadrants that each meant something different, right? So that's what I was talking about. Also, what I meant was go away with the specific code side defined tags and leave picking down to reference specifically by path or asset name that's based on the source asset file. I don't really want anything to be based on the source asset file at the moment, though. I implemented an animation system based on your tag system where every animation frame is tagged with a number between 0 and tau, and as the t-value loop goes up, it says, hey, go to the next sprite, but not sure it's a good idea. Do you see any problems with this and or how to do 2D animations normally? Know which sprite to grab? No, I don't see any problem with that. The only thing I would mention is that the efficiency of the query may be kind of in question. So I would say always keep your tags, sprites sorted in a way that's easy to look them up by that t-value to accelerate the fact that that's such a common case. So that's really the thing that I would think you would need to know. But no, it's a totally reasonable way to do it because that's sort of what you do normally with t-lookups. A lot of times animations have fixed frame rates, at which point you don't need to store the t. You can just look it up as an array, right? So you may want to look into, hey, am I always storing, is the t always going up by a fixed amount anyway? And if so, then just store them in have a more compact format for storing those kinds of tag sets. But yeah, I mean, it's not the craziest thing I've ever heard. Any more on topic questions? Any more on topic questions? Not looking likely. All right. Let me just close it down here. Actually, but I made those changes. We should make sure we still build. Yeah. All right. Let me close this down. No. And close that. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you as always. If you want to follow the series at home, you can always pre-order the game on handmadehero.org, and it comes with a source code so that you can play around with it yourself. We also have a whole bunch of website stuff there if you are interested in exploring a little more. We've got a watch page that where you can do really good like lookups to old episodes or have a thing that tells you when the stream's going to be live and all kinds of stuff. So check that out. It's a really easy way to watch the series, whether it's new episodes or old episodes. We have an FAQ for frequently asked questions. Obviously, those are anyone's watching the series by now probably already knows those. But we also have a Handmade Fund contribution page where you can help support things like the Handmade Network and the annotated episode guide to Handmade Hero that community people do that we try to help pay them for. And then, of course, you can always click on the Handmade Hero head if you want to go to our other Molly Rocket websites, like the game that I work on during the day, or our upcoming comic book, or Anna and I's blogs, that sort of stuff. that's about it for today. I'll be back here next week. Don't forget to check that watch page for the schedule. It'll be updated pretty soon with when the next Handmade Hero broadcast dates are. Until then, have fun programming, everyone, and I'll see you on the internet. Take it easy, everybody.